what would and wouldn't happen if the election result was based on the most recent poll. But I think you've got to zoom out a bit and look at the trend in the polls. I am aware that no party is going to get more than 0 or 1 or 2 seats unless they are polling above 20% in the polls, roughly speaking. That seems to be a consensus from pollsters and commentators from across the spectrum. And different polls are putting the scores at different levels. I mean, thank you to all of you who voted in my polls on YouTube and on X. Interesting results. I have a lot of Reform supporters on my YouTube, in my YouTube following. Something like 45% of the vote would vote Reform. On X, it wasn't quite as high, but it was still higher than anyone else. It was 38% on X. And we had nearly 2,000 votes and then 35%. So, yeah, hey, listen, I can't control my audience. And everyone from every background is welcome if you're here to talk about housing. But this is what I think politics, when you're talking about it, should be about. I think it's not about what we personally feel or think about any party or person or even policy. If you want to see what's going to happen in an election, you've got to think to yourself, you've got to remove all emotion completely, remove all opinion about policies and go, which demographics are going to react how to these different events, right? Totally objective, impartial. So this takes me back to my politics studies, right? And I had the best politics teacher. So after I got expelled from school, Alex, I ended up at a tutorial in Brighton. I had one-to-one tuition for my A-levels. And I had this, I mean, he was basically a rock guitarist who was paying the bills by teaching politics. We used to sit in these 2 wing-backed leather armchairs in his attic, smoking and drinking during the day. I was a teenager. Talking about politics. And he was brilliant because he was, as a teacher, I mean, I remember that particular place I went to, it was in Brighton. They did have outstandingly good teachers because it was really expensive. And they had very high quality teachers there. And I never once, even, he wouldn't admit to me privately what his politics were. And as a teacher of politics to me, I've never forgot that I could not tell what his political leanings were.
But then he was doing his job properly.
That's my point. And this is the point. I've kept that with me. And I think that's why I've never, ever been a supporter of any one political party. I've always taken a look at, well, hang on a second. Who's doing what and why? How's that likely to affect votes and polls and all this kind of stuff? So this is why I think, this is what I'm hoping our discussion now might be like, right? It's not about whether you think anyone is or isn't, insert expletive adverb or adjective here. It's about how you think the electorate is going to react. That's what I think is worth discussing. And if you can just discuss it like that, hopefully it doesn't trigger anyone too much. Yeah. So the thing that I've noticed that most people are saying is that it's not going to make a difference to the election. Nigel Farage's appearance as an election candidate and leader of the Reform Party is not going to make a difference to the outcome of the election, because the only thing he's going to do is take Tory votes away, and therefore he's going to increase the likelihood of a Labour victory. That's a generalization of the consensus view, right? Would you agree with that observation?
That is what most people are saying, yes.
Yeah. So I'm not asking if you agree with the statement. I'm asking if you agree that that's what most people seem to be saying. Now, I think 2 things. First of all, I think that there is a large population of people in this country from a complete spectrum of social demographic backgrounds who find politics itself overwhelming, boring, annoying, frustrating, and don't actually have a political home, but tend to vote the way that they do because that's what their mates or their family do. Right?
Mm-hmm.
which is fine. That's just the way it is. A lot of people don't really know. They haven't looked into the details. They haven't studied policies. They don't even like talking about politics, frankly, because they don't have enough information at hand to be able to express an opinion, which is why it always ends up discussing into what do you think of that bloke, what do you think of that woman, which is in my view an utterly futile exercise to discuss the individuals because it's of no consequence really. Discussing their actions, discussing their achievements, yes, but discussing the individuals is pointless because anyway. So first of all, the polls show a Conservative wipeout is almost a certainty, right? All of them are saying like very, very low, single digits, basically. Therefore, there aren't that many more votes to be had from the Conservatives. They've already lost most of them, according to the polls. And what's left are just the dyed-in-the-wool. Either they're just lifelong Tory voters, or they're people who, like I described, just vote Tory because that's what they do, and that's what their friends do, and that's it, and they don't really want to talk about it. That's what's left. But so many previously floating voters who were floating but tended to vote Tory are so pissed off with 14 years of Tory rule that they're going, right, off you go, we're going to vote Labour now because there is no other credible party to vote. Voting Lib Dem is a wasted vote, voting Green is a wasted vote, we're just going to vote Labour because actually the current iteration of Labour isn't that different, it's not extremely left-wing, and therefore as former Tory voters we're not that uncomfortable voting for Keir Starmer because he's basically a kind of Tory light. It's like this is the whole uniparty, they're both the same thing, voting for the same thing. And so I think there is a large part of the people who are perceived and the people who these tiny, tiny polls are telling us are currently going to vote Labour, who are doing so because they don't think anyone else is worth voting for. Now, because this demographic that I described to you from across the political spectrum and from across the demographic spectrum, and I'm talking about across the age spectrum, across the background spectrum, whether they are born and bred Brits or whether they're immigrants, it doesn't matter. Across all of those spectrums, the element of those demographics who do talk about the people in the politics, right? They don't talk about policies because they don't have them at their fingertips what policies are. They've suddenly got Nigel Farage to talk about. And most people won't talk about Nigel Farage and support him publicly. There are plenty who do, but I think there are more who secretly support him who don't say so. I really think that. And I don't think that's borne out in the polls. I think maybe it's borne out in my poll. And that's why I think that the chances of reform actually getting enough votes to get enough seats. I understand how the voting system works. I understand how seats work. And I understand about how if they aren't concentrated in the right places, they won't get the seats and all that kind of stuff, right? I still think that there is a potential swing of people who will privately, secretly, they might not even have told their family and friends that they're going to vote for reform, but they're going to. That's what I think is going to happen. A lot more than people realize. There's no question of them getting into power. I don't, that's just not going to happen. I mean, if it did, I would eat my own hat. Labour will get the most seats. I no longer think it's a certainty that they will get a majority. Let me be clear. I'm saying I don't think it's a certainty they'll get a majority. Is it still likely they'll get a majority? Possibly. Is it less likely that, but still possible, that Reform will get enough seats to be in opposition? Okay, even if Labour get a majority, it might be Reform who are in opposition. If what I've just said is true, which is far more people end up voting, and it does actually create a weird landslide from Tory voters to Reform voters. So it's just an absolute Tory wipeout. And we have Reform in, hypothetically, potentially, as the opposition. I don't think that's impossible. I think it's unlikely. I don't think it's impossible. And for me, the Tories would be such an ineffective opposition to Labour because they've just ceased to function as a party. That's what I see, right? I mean, I don't think Labour functions as a party either, but I think the Tories have ceased to function completely as a party. They just don't. They've actually, for some time, they've just ceased functioning as a party. They've got an unelected. Even their own members didn't vote for their current leader. It's just, it's almost like a sort of weird caretaker situation at the moment, just waiting for the election. So, and I want to put this up on screen because this actually was one of the most useful comments I have seen. Here we are, from someone on YouTube who commented on this point. Right now, this is a fantastic example of what I call a constructive and robust counter argument to what I'm saying. All right. So this is a comment on my post on YouTube where I said what I just said to you guys, right? And so Le Fricola, if that's how he's pronounced his name, says, I generally agree with your take. Is that on the screen?
Yeah.
I generally agree with your takes, but this is miles off. Firstly, Reform was polling at about 12%, but was still a long way from projection to win a single seat because of the first past the post system. With a 5% swing, they still might, and are probably, not be forecast to win a single seat. Secondly, Labour will have absolutely nothing to do with Reform under any circumstances. Hell, they'll get into bed with the SNP before Nigel Farage. Okay. Thirdly, the emergence of Reform currently only means that Labour's majority will increase. Okay. And fourthly, housing is probably one of the least likely policy areas to be on the table in any hung parliament negotiation. It's not something which is influencing voting for the majority of the electorate. Okay, I'd like to respond to those and then ask you because I've been talking for a long time now. Polling at 12% might get another 5% to 17%. Well, they're already polling at 17, 18% now, and they're trending upwards. So my reaction to that first point is, I suspect that the polling trend is going to continue to rise, firstly. And I do think they're going to win more seats than anyone expects. Secondly, Labour have absolutely nothing to do with Reform under any circumstances. So he's talking about the potential of a hung parliament. In this scenario where it genuinely, hypothetical, right? Labour do not have a majority. Conservatives have got far fewer seats. Reform have got the second largest number of seats, or Conservative and Reform have got a similar number of seats. And Conservative plus Reform equals enough to make a government. And therefore, the only way that Labour makes a government is if it gives in and does a coalition with Reform. This chap is saying they would walk away from that. I don't believe any party would walk away from a distasteful coalition. I just don't believe they would. But I could be wrong about that. That's one of the things I'd love to ask you. In that scenario, do you think Labour would turn their nose up and go, no, we'd rather not be in government than do a coalition with you guys?
No.
You don't know exactly. So he said the emergence of Reform means Labour's majority will increase. I disagree with that for reasons I've explained. And that was interesting, his last point. Fourthly, housing is one of the least likely policy areas to be on the table in any hung parliament. Yeah, fair enough. I see that, but what I think might happen, I suppose, what would I hope for in a scenario anything like this? If we ended up with Nigel Farage as the leader of the opposition, I just think he's such a pain in the arse in that scenario that he might actually effect better policy changes than would happen if it was the Tories in opposition. Doesn't mean I like him, doesn't mean I'm a supporter of him. What I mean is I think it'll actually get stuff done potentially because they will already be thinking and worrying about the next election. So I will shut my trap.
And you can have the opposing view. So look, my view is quite simple on this. Farage is a very divisive figure. You either love him or hate him.
Very.
And he is most known for Brexit. When we look at the Brexit vote, roughly 72% of the electorate turned out of 46 million people. That means 33 million people voted. Only 12%, it's estimated, under 4 million. Only 12% of those people who voted for Brexit were Labour supporters. Now, that's not an accurate figure. That's from a whole bunch of different polls. We don't know for certain, obviously, but that suggests that it would have to be a massive upset for a substantial proportion of Labour supporters to switch to Reform. So you're right, they'll pick up people from floating. They may pick up many from the Conservatives, where most of them will come from, and a whole bunch of others who, for various reasons, both good and bad, might think that Farage is the right person for the country. However, I still, the maths on it suggests that Labour will win an outright government. It will not be a hung parliament. However, you're right, it's not impossible. I mean, it's certainly not impossible. As you've said, actually, for housing, you've looked at the Lib Dems and they've got the best manifesto on housing. And, you know, some of their other policies from the things that I've read look pretty reasonable. I've never voted Lib Dem in my life, but we just don't know until the election. I agree with you that if we were in the situation where it had to be a coalition between Labour and Reform, Labour would bite the hand off because they want to be in power. However, they could form coalitions, not just with one other party. You can have a three-party coalition. You can have an all-party coalition. You know, it starts to get really tricky at that point. The thing that I absolutely agree with you on is that we need change in this country. And somebody wrote to you yesterday, I think on X, saying, well, you know, you just want change. Would you take it if it meant this? And, you know, my answer, and I've spent my working life effecting change at companies operationally and, you know, through capital projects. And the reason is this: when any system, whether it's a company, a religion, a political system, gets to the point where it is in decline, the status quo is in decline. I think we can say that this country has been going downhill now for a number of decades. The best thing to do at that point is to change. And people will go, well, yeah, but change for change's sake doesn't help. Well, if the status quo is declining, it is a very strong argument that making a change, even if it's the wrong change, even if that change is not effective, is better because you have overcome the inertia of the status quo. You have a body in motion, and steering something that is moving is much easier than steering something that is either stationary or dead. You know, if you're a sailor or a motorboat enthusiast, the rudder doesn't work unless you're going forwards, or you fly airplanes. You know, rudders not much use to you unless you've got motion. And at the moment, we have been static in this country for decades. And that is worse for us long term than the pain that might be implemented by bringing in a Farage to run the country. Yeah, people will hate it. It will be terrible, but boy, it'll move them. And when it moves them, then real change, useful change will be affected. It's transitory pain for long-term gain. So, you know, we'll see. I don't think Farage, I think Reform will win many more votes than people expect. And I think they will win some seats. But I don't think it'll be a hung parliament, is my view.
Do you think, even if it's not a hung parliament, there's a chance of seeing Farage in opposition rather than the Tories?
Jesus, the way the Tories are polling at the moment, yeah. I hate to say it, but there's a higher chance of that than of there being a hung parliament.
That's my point. This is why this is such big news to me. Because even with Farage just in opposition, but Labour having a majority, that is a very different House of Parliament, Houses of Commons, to Labour with the Tory opposition. Because the Tory opposition will be basically absent, because they're going to be going through a complete, you know, who knows what's going to happen. They're going to effectively go a bit like Voldemort, just disappeared into the wilderness for a few years in Harry Potter. You know, it's just like ceased to exist.
We'll start to see skulls in the sky.
Right, yeah, exactly. But, you know, I just think politics would be interesting. I mean, he's even stated his intention. I don't think Farage has any interest in actually running the country. I don't think he does. He's too much of a bon vivant. He just wants to sit in the pub and smoke and drink. That's fine.
And disrupt. He is a classic disruptor.
He calls himself an issues campaigner. He repeatedly calls himself that, right? And so in other words, he's a hungry. He wants to be a bloody nuisance. And he said, I want vote me to Westminster so I can be a bloody nuisance. And my point is that the housing market, whatever you think of Farage, the housing market might see some change, any change. And it's more likely with a Labour majority, okay, that we see change with with a reform in opposition than if we see then it's more likely that we see change with reform in opposition than if we have the Tories in opposition. That's my point. As you just said, there's a very real chance of that happening. That's why this is big news that he's chosen to stand, because he has clearly mobilized things. He has clearly altered the course of this election. There's no question about that. No question. And you know, don't confuse. People should not confuse my excitement at the possibility of change coming in the housing market
with you loving Farage.
Exactly.
But you do love him.
No. I love how entertaining it is to watch him. I love how entertaining it is. I love the fact he's just a grenade. He's a grenade thrower. Ka-ching. Mm-hmm. You know, you watch him in the European Parliament, and the way he just stood there insulting them all.
He is an orator, and he is a bright, insightful orator. Whether you believe in his policies or not is sort of irrelevant in this situation, simply because it's not Tory, it's not Labour, it is different. It will motivate people, whether in a good way or a bad way. It will get some bloody movement, which is what this country needs.
And Prime Minister's Questions time with Farage versus Starmer is just going to be a walkover every single time, because Starmer is a wet blanket at the just.
Oh yeah, useless. Which for a QC or KC, whatever it would be now, you know, you have to wonder.
Anyway, I despair at the complete lack of any meaningful change being put forward by the Tories or Labour in housing. Just absolutely despair of it. It's also astonishing to me how, up until this week's announcement of Farage throwing his hat in the ring, everyone was just bored with the. This is the other thing. This whole £2,000 worse off under Labour, whether was he lying or not, for that to be the dominating topic of the week, to me, couldn't be a better example of why we're just like, what, really? That is what's going to get all the headlines? And Sunak saying £2,000 and Starmer calling him a liar. That's what we're going to all write about? Really? Come on.
But don't you love the fact that whether it's £2,000 or £3,000 under the Tories, nobody has yet put down, that I have seen, a definitive answer. Everyone is still arguing a point. And if you can argue over how much tax is actually going to be collected at a very, simple calculation, then either something's wrong with our tax system, our mathematicians, or it's just all lies.
Yeah, exactly. I love this comment. Fraggle H says, change is always a risk. Yeah, I agree. Of course it is. But change is necessary. Yeah. Florian G says, that's a good point. Make people embrace change. That's the problem. I think as a country, we are guilty of going, we're not happy. Everything's terrible. No. Don't change anything. No, exactly. Don't. We want change, but you can't change anything. All right. No. Just keep it just as it is, but change everything. But don't change anything.
Because for the vast majority of the population of this country, it's never been so good. Don't get me wrong. The cost of living recently has been horrible, and the lack of wage growth since 2008. But you've got Netflix, haven't you? You've got a nice big telly. You can eat decent food. By decent, I mean you can get food from all over the world at any time of the year. Yeah, I mean, we live in places where we don't have to walk outside in the cold to take a shit. You've got plumbing and you've got water you can drink from the tap. And actually, although there is a lot to complain about, we've just got so used to the comfort that the possibility of risking any lowering of standards by changing it, we just go, oh, no, it's too difficult. And that's how empires are destroyed.
I've got an anecdote about this. I used to run a hand car wash in the car park of Crawley Station in West Sussex. That's a statement that will surprise many people. It was after I'd been fired from my job in the city, and right in the early days of me finding my own way as someone who wanted to be my own boss. But I had a lease with British Rail. and it was all legit, properly set up, and I employed up to, at one point 16 people. I was 23 years old, and most of them were out of prison. And for a posh boy brought up in lap of luxury, this was a very, very unexpected career turn. Me to be managing most of these guys who were older than me and everything else. Anyway, what's the point of the story? The problem with hand car washes, as anyone who's been will know, is that either they're dead and they're empty, or they've got queues. It's all because it's weather dependent and time of the week dependent. And so I had this problem in my business, which was that we were losing money whenever it was busy because we couldn't get the cars through fast enough. So I offered my team a zero downside, upside only option to their pay, which was for every car we cleaned over a certain number, they would get an extra bonus. There was no downside. This was like your fixed hourly pay stays the same no matter what. But when it's really, really busy, if we get busy, it's harder work, isn't it? So you all deserve a bit more money. And I announced this thinking they're going to love this. The next day, Charlie, we want to have a word with you, please. Okay, cool. I thought, great, this is going to be brilliant. We don't like the new pay system. We want to keep it as it is.
The reasoning?
I thought to myself, hang on a second. Is it a wind up? Was it not a wind up? And the end of the conversation was, if we don't understand it, we don't trust it. We want to know, we do this many hours, we get this much pay, end of.
But you could have more pay.
I mean, what you're suggesting, we don't know how much we're going to get. And I said, but it'll either be the same as you're getting or more. And they're like, no, sorry, please just leave it the way it is. I've never forgotten that. Because they were all in agreement.
Yes.
All in agreement.
I mean, that's nuts. I'm just voting off my own fingers.
I remember saying to them, is it a trust thing? Like, no, we do trust you. We wouldn't work for you if we didn't trust you. And everything. I said, because then if you trust me, why don't you trust me? Let's just try it. No, please, honestly. And what I think it comes down to is a lot of people want certainty without question.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Just certainty without question is more valuable to them than uncertainty that should be better. They just want certainty.
I understand that. I mean, if you're to talk about estate agents, the old days of the negotiator who got absolutely peanut salary and it was all bonus dependent, I understand that they would like some more certainty and they would be willing to take lower bonuses. But if there's no downside, if you're going to get the same wage anyway, and the only thing is upside, at that point, it's a bit nuts.
Do you know what? I tried to keep pushing it and they actually got cross with me, so I left it.
Yeah.
And what I did was that I actually just, because I wanted to calculate, in their mind, I wanted them to think every extra car we do is an extra quid or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
On top of our basic pay. But in the end, what I did was I just, when we had a good day, I just gave them a bit extra. And they were always grateful for that.
But it wasn't formal. If you'd made it formal, not happy.
It's funny, isn't it? And I can't remember why I told that story, but it's about people not liking change.
Yeah. No, well, they don't. I mean, it's the hardest thing when you get brought into a large multinational sort of firm, and they say, "Look, we've got a real problem here," and you say, "Right, we can change. We need to change these things." It takes a few years to learn that the first thing you have to do when people say you have to bring the staff on the journey, as a 25-year-old, you go and slam your face into a desk and start ranting at people. As a 45-year-old, you go, yeah, if we don't actually get this familiarized around the entire office, get people's buy-in, set up stupid stakeholder groups, get working groups together, get it advertised, they'll never adopt it. And your success or failure depends entirely on your communication skill at the outset.
Yeah. I had another quick one, because it's quite a funny one, it's a shorter one. So when we were doing photography and floor plans and virtual tours for estate agents in London, we had offices in Richmond, and we had about 20 people in the office, and we had about 20 guys out on the road shooting photographs and floor plans all day. And we had an office full of Dell computers. I had a Dell laptop. Everyone else had Dell computers, because right there, they were the best value. And this was early 2000s. And I remember deciding myself to try an Apple MacBook, because I thought to myself, they're twice the price and people are buying them. And I don't believe people are buying them just because they've got more money than sense. There must be a reason. And I decided to buy one. And it took me about 2 weeks to get familiar with the differences, the operating system differences. And after that, I was like, oh my God, this is great. So I said to my office, okay, guys, who wants to change to Apple Macs? And they were all like, all of them. No. We like our Windows. We know our Windows. Leave it at that. And I said, well, look, I think, because all of you complain that your computers crash, Windows crashes 2 or 3 times a day, get blue screen of death, blah, blah, blah. I said, I'm going to get 4 iMacs, so 4 of you, just 20% of you. You can volunteer, or otherwise I'll pick you. Anyway, I got 4, put them in there, and I said, 30 days. Just use it for 30 days, and after that, I will give you your Dells back if you don't like it. And so after 30 days, I came and said, right, guys, I come to take your iMacs. They're like, no! And they loved them. And then the rest of the office changed. And it's this like, I had to kind of force it on them. And then once they tried it, they liked it. Oh my God, selling estate agency software to agents is like 10 times worse than that. Anyway, sorry. I'm rambling here, but yeah. One last point I wanted to bring up with you. Last week we talked about the mortgage approvals number ticking up.
Yeah.
And that might be making me think, oh, maybe there's more. It feels like a blip to me. I mean, looking at everything else,
yes,
it's all looking negative in terms of the economy itself, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
People keep saying, oh, but the Purchase Managers Index, just the global S&P Purchase Managers Index for the UK has just come out, and it's 54 now. Does that matter? I mean, what is it? How relevant is that index?
Well, I mean, it is relevant, but it's based on gut feel. I mean, it's not hard science, and this is your problem. People are feeling it's spring. Everyone feels a bit more frisky and optimistic in spring, don't they? Or summer, and this is the problem. A lot of this is not objective; it's subjective. But can I share a screen with you?
Yeah, I love to. Always. Everyone loves that when you do that.
Just because somebody mentioned it earlier, and you're talking about the economy, and although these charts are a little old, they are from February, I think. Oh, come on!
While you're doing that, someone called Adomus on YouTube says, Charlie, it took me 12 years to get on the housing ladder. The only reason why is because for the first time, house prices fell to where my wage could just attain one.
Yeah.
He goes on to say, I spent all that time chasing the rung.
There you go.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I can't remember who mentioned this, but somebody did earlier. You can see this graph runs from 1955 all the way to 2023. It actually runs to 24. The last quarter of 23, beginning of 24. This is gross domestic product per capita.
Is this on X, by the way, this graph?
Yeah, I think so. I posted these.
Because people would love to go and look at that in detail on their own. So while you're talking about it, I'm going to see if I can find it on your timeline, and I'll put a link to it.
So when they talk about our economy and how strong it is and how GDP has grown, all this sort of good stuff, you've got to put that in the context of how many people have come into the country. And yes, total GDP has grown, but if you want to work out whether you feel wealthier or not, you need to have GDP per capita. And also bear in mind that there are a small number of very rich people in this country and a large number of really quite poor people. So this is averaged per capita, and that's not the way it actually works. But what you can see is from 1975, after the early 70s recession, all the way through until 2008, our GDP per capita really was going up. These 3 green trend lines are all heading in the same place. The last time we were as bad as we were from 08 through until 19 was all the way back in the 50s, the post-war period, and 60s, where you still had rationing for some of that period. But this is our recovery from COVID. And what you can see is actually there is no recovery. As somebody pointed out in your comments earlier, we've actually been technically in recession from 2019 onwards. So if I just zoom that in a little bit, you can now see this is just a zoomed in version from 1981. After the recession of the early 90s, it took 14 quarters to get back to our pre-recession level. After the 2008 recession, it took 29 quarters to get back to pre-recession level.
7 years.
Yep.
No, yeah.
And here you can see, and bear in mind, this is quarterly GDP per capita. So multiply that by 4, which will take you up to the £35,000 a year. That is the average salary. And there you go. You know, that's what we're really looking at. So when people talk to you about, yes, the economy is going gangbusters. No, there's strength in the economy. I'm not even looking at commercial real estate here. I mean, nothing. Not looking at debt, not looking at servicing debt. This is just our productivity. I mean, the base case. Without productivity, you can't service your debt because you have no money. You can't invest in public infrastructure because you have no income, no purse for the country. When you tax people, you get less tax because they're not earning enough to be paying the tax, and so on and so forth. So quality of living goes down. So the first thing that you look at, much as it's a fudged statistic, is per capita GDP. And that tells you right away things are not on the up. And this election is without change in the country. This election will change nothing in terms of where we are going, in how we feel day to day, in how wealthy we are, how happy we are. All of these things predicated from this set of data.
Can I ask you a question about that graph?
Yeah.
To you, is this one of the most significant charts to show the true extent of how truthfully our economy is performing? I mean,
yes.
When you look at it over, what is it, going back to the 50s? Well, that's 70 years or something. I mean, that's 1981 you're going back to. It does look sort of, you can ignore the COVID part, right? It's just bizarre. I mean, because I think people who are not perhaps fluent in dealing with graphs might think that anything other than a downward spike is irrelevant. It's quite hard to understand that the long-term trend of that graph is fairly stable with a few blips here and there. What's happening now looks different to all those other times.
Yeah.
It just looks like it's just over. It's just over.
This is the decay of the first world. I mean, don't get me wrong, America's graph looks slightly different, but that is only because they are the global reserve currency. Look at France, look at Spain, look at Italy. Again, Canada, Australia, slightly different situations because they started from a much lower benchmark. They were later in their cycle. In the 70s, they were still paying Brits to go out to work in Australia. Whereas the 70s was the first time in this country, just after the 70s, that we became an immigration country. Before that, we'd had Brits going out of the country around the world to make their money in America, in Australia, all of these sort of places, because England was a pretty grimy place in the early 70s, after we were still in the recovery period after the Second World War. But from 75 onwards, look at this, bang, 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 all those green lines. Look, we're all getting richer and richer and richer. This blue line from 08 to 19 would have been substantially lower than that if it hadn't been for the quantitative easing. And yet, all that did was just push it off to the point that we're at today, where, we're in even greater decline. And this hasn't got any better in the first quarter of 24. It's continued that trend going down.
Just quickly also to recap, the relevance of this stuff to the housing market is that in the medium and long term, for people expecting house prices to continue rising, it just, and this is why even Richard Donald from Zupa agrees that there's going to be no real house price growth for some time.
Yeah, decades.
And therefore, people who think that buying a home is a good financial move shouldn't think that anymore. And this is why. This is why. Right? It's just not possible. You buy a home to have a home, 100%. I've never said don't buy a home if you need a home, but do not think, because all I can hear over and over again is people saying, "Oh, house prices double every 10 years." That's not true when you take inflation into account. Number one, and number two, the fact that they even have doesn't mean that they will. It just doesn't mean that they're going to continue doing that.
Yeah.
I've found myself asking the question because I gave Rachel Reeves some pretty harsh criticism recently. By the way, I linked to that graph in the live chat. There's a link to that tweet with that graph for those of you who want to go have a look at it. I was pretty harsh about Rachel Reeves. She did that interview saying, "Oh, I used to work at the Bank of England, therefore I know how to be Chancellor." That frustrated me, and I posted about it. And I thought to myself, okay, Charlie, what would I do if I was Chancellor? What headline grabbing thing if I was going to be Chancellor and I was trying to get myself elected in a party where I was going to be the Chancellor? What would I do? And I thought about it a lot. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you or not. I don't think I have.
No.
I would. This is going to upset environmentalists. I would scrap, as in scrap, fuel duty.
Right. There's a lot of tax in that.
No, it's 24 billion a year.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not that much in the grand scheme. Okay. It's 24 billion a year, which is less than 2 months of the NHS costs. And the point is that it benefits the lowest income people the most. It's an instant, overnight thing that requires almost no logistics, almost no administration, just a little bit, right? It would instantly give a shot in the arm to businesses, people who have to commute. So if you think about people who work from home tend to have slightly higher paid jobs than people who need to travel to work because their job is a physical one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? So lower paid people would get the biggest benefit proportionately out of a scrapping of fuel duty. And it's not perfect. And people go, "Oh, but what about the environment?" Like, honestly, it's not going to change. We might see a slight increase in how much fuel gets used, but Britain on a global level doesn't even move the needle in the margin of error of carbon dioxide emissions. It doesn't matter. And also people's ability to make a living and pay their bills is more. Yes, we all want a nice future, but also we want an okay now, please.
Yep.
And so, and I also thought about businesses, small businesses, all businesses. Fuel duty. You would give the economy a shot in the arm, because it wouldn't just be the value of the duty being put back into the economy. It would be mobility, actual physical mobility. People would go out more. People would see each other more. I just think that would catalyze a little bit of a rebound in the economy as a whole, for small businesses, for individuals. I really think it would make a massive difference.
You're going mad, because the next thing you'd say, if we want the mobility in the country, is we're going to have to get rid of stamp duty.
But
wow, fuel duty and stamp duty. In fact, let's get rid of all the duties, especially on alcohol.
No, you still would have taxed fags and booze.
That seems very unfair.
I get that.
I go nowhere.
Well, yes, I know what you're saying, but I would scrap stamp duty. It would need to be replaced with something different. But again, I just honestly, why hasn't that happened? Why haven't people reformed property taxes?
Yeah,
because government is not functioning correctly, and they couldn't, even if they decided they wanted to, it wouldn't happen.
Okay, so this is where we get really political, Charlie.
Yeah.
Have you been watching what's happening in Argentina?
I've not been watching it closely, but I'm vaguely aware of it. Yeah, go on.
You want to talk about shaking up politics, making a change in the country?
Tell us, give us a heads up for people who don't know.
No, it's so much. I mean, you need to have a look at what he's been doing. since getting power. I mean, just
It's
we'll
the
see.
most recent case study that socialism bankrupts countries and ending socialism stops the deficit, right?
Yeah, I mean, old Javier, we'll have to see. He calls himself, well, he's a member of the Libertarian Party, but the sort of work that he's doing to change everything from their general laws to their bureaucracy, massive. And now it's almost to the point where you would say, well, like a dictator. And I think you and I have discussed many times my view on dictatorship as a form of government is about the only way you get things done. So, we'll see. We'll see. But for all of your audience, it's definitely worth having a look at. I can never pronounce his surname. It's Milei, Javier Milei, the president, prime minister, whatever he is of Argentina. Just have a look at some of the laws that he's passed.
You've reminded me about something that I said, which is when I was complaining about Rachel Reeves being, if that's the chancellor we're faced with, then we really are fucked, because she doesn't even know how incompetent she's going to be in that job. And someone said to me, well, who would you recommend, Charlie? And I said, well, someone who's got track record of delivering tangible improvements in a large organization. And someone said, oh, but the government's not a business. Now, I would argue differently. I would argue that running the government is like running a business, because you've got customers who are paying you money, i.e. you've got the taxpayers. You've got suppliers. And in a really simplistic way, you've got a business. The government is a business where the customers are paying very high prices, very high taxes. But the business is so badly run that the company is being ripped off by its suppliers, who are charging really high prices and not delivering to basic service levels. And so what's this business selling? It's selling opportunity and quality of life in society. That's what it's selling. It's selling security, health, opportunity, and quality of life. And it's not selling any of those things very well, is it? If you think about it. And that's what the government's doing. They're saying, hey, choose us to run this business where we're going to sell you security, opportunity, education, health, and a better way of life. That's what they're pitching us, is they want to run the business that sells us those things in return for our tax money. And unless you've operated businesses where you do have to measure the input and output and results and the metrics, if you've got people running in government who don't believe in that sort of thing, like actually looking at the inputs and outputs and going, is there value for money here? Then you end up with a situation that we've got, which is this bloated, ineffective thing where we've got, at the same time as the highest taxes ever, we've got the worst public services in living memory.
Yeah.
And so if you put idealists into government, like Argentina had before Milei, it gets worse and worse and worse, because what do? They throw more and more and more of taxpayers' money, because they borrow, just thinking that money alone, more money will solve the problem. And there are how many countless businesses left that out there who've borrowed more money and still failed. Anyway, Alex, you said you got to go. We probably should be going, an hour and 20 minutes. Anyway, guys, thank you very, very much. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that was interesting. Lots of stuff we could go on talking about. For all new followers here, Alex, if you've got to shoot off, go for it.
Okay, Charlie.